Welcome you. If you're not already members, I'd highly recommend that you consider joining us. We charge a lot if you come for one night only, 450 baht, but you'll find that our membership rates are extremely low. We have a wonderful location. You can come here and work during the daytime. We have a good restaurant, a friendly bar. So if you haven't joined, please give it some thought. Before we get on, can we have some quiet at the bar, please? Quiet. Thanks. Right, before we get going, I'll give you a rundown on a few items that are coming up. On Friday, we have an exhibition opening of pictures here. We have 6 Filipino photographers in town who have been covering the drugs-related pogrom in the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. They will come in, they will tell you what it's like to go out on the night shift every night and photograph the corpses. Duterte's killed over 10,000 people now in his war on drugs in a little over a year, and people in the Philippines are now actually too frightened to count the numbers, so there is no official tally. And interestingly, we've already had trolls and death threats against the club for having the exhibition, so it gives you an idea of what's behind it. On Monday, we've got a very old documentary which is called Manufacturing Consent with Noam Chomsky and the media, and it's well worth watching if you haven't seen it. Next week, we have Barry Brogan, who's the former CIA station chief in Rangoon, and a long time, he was a member of the club in the 70s, and he's a long-time operator in this part of the world. And he will be showing a new film on Jim Thompson and who killed him. It's a new theory, it's controversial. I won't say any more than that, but he'll be here, and he'll be here with a panel of people who are involved in this new take on the situation. The following week, we're going to take a look at Cambodia and the meltdown in democracy there. Hun Sen is closing every media outlet that's conceivably critical of him, and he's closing down the human rights operations and making life very difficult for everybody ahead of his elections next year. There is now no official opposition left in Cambodia, and we already have people speaking. We have Sebastian Strangio coming, who is one of the best informed foreign correspondents in Phnom Penh at the moment. He'll be coming in on Skype. And we have Kingsley Abbott of the International Federation of ICJ, and he'll be coming as well. So he'll be in the studio in the club with us, and there will be others. And one final thing, on December 15th, that's a Friday, there'll be the annual Christmas party in the club. So if you want to come, we'd love to have you. There's lots of room. It'll be a full trim Western Christmas dinner. And so to this evening, Mr. Benjamin Zawacki. It's very unusual that anybody comes across the world for an FCCT program. So I'd like to welcome particularly John and Catherine Zawacki, who are sitting here, who've flown all the way from Philadelphia? Close, somewhere in the US, to be here with Benjamin, who's their second son. Benjamin has lived and worked in Thailand for 15 years and is a long-time member of the FCCT. He's spoken here on many occasions before, and also regularly contributes interviews and commentaries to the press and foreign media in general. He completed a 1-year visiting fellowship in support of this book, which is part of the Human Rights program at Harvard Law School. He did that in 2015. And through until the middle of 2016, he held a 5-year term membership on the Council of Foreign Relations. That's based in Washington, right? Previously, he was the Southeast Asia researcher for Amnesty International, after which he served as a policy advisor for President Jimmy Carter, former president, and 2 other global elders, quotation marks, in Myanmar, which was Burma. He's done other work in the UN Refugee Agency, the International Commission of Jurists, and the Asia Foundation. He's a graduate of the George Washington University law school and the College of the Holy Cross, and he's also the only person in the world who's read every single WikiLeaks related to Thailand. Took him a whole winter. So on that, Benjamin, stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thanks for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. I need to apologize from the outset that my voice has been cracking off and on with a bit of a cold, so if I need to clear my throat or cough, please forgive me. The FCCT is really a fitting place for me to be launching this book, as a good number of conversations I've had here starting a decade ago acted as a kind of inspiration and impetus toward turning both political storylines and small personal stories into something coherent. While a majority of my book concerns the current geopolitical situation in the region and Thailand's recent past, part of it is also history: World War II, Vietnam, the refugee crisis, the financial crash. And as I state in the foreword of the book, many of the people I spoke with, initially over a coffee or a beer, and eventually interviewed more formally, would do a real service in sharing their stories more fully than I was able to do in these pages. I can't tell you how many times I asked Derek Williams, who left us earlier this year for New Zealand, to put his stories in writing. The recent passing of William Warren, Jim Thompson's biographer and longtime American artist and academic in Thailand, is a reminder that if our understanding of history generally grows, the further we are removed from it, this happens as the makers and the witnesses of that history pass from the scene. In just the 3 years I spent writing this book, Thailand's two longest serving foreign ministers, Tanat Koman and Chief Air Marshal Sit, died, as did, of course, His Majesty the King, Rama IX. Yet, many of you are still here, and some of you are with us this evening. Speaking of foreign ministers, Kun Kantati Supamankon is here, as is Lieutenant Colonel Chalermsuk Yukon. I believe David Lyman is here. Paul Waddell, Jim Stent, Matt Wheeler, Tony Davis, Sean Crispin, Kun Prawit, Bob Fitz, perhaps among others. Thanks to all of you, and indeed to the more than 90 persons, some of whom anonymously, who agreed to interviews for this book. You made the process and the product infinitely more enjoyable to both write and read. A special shout out to my good friends Matt Buer and Nigel Pickles, both of whom, alongside a few others here tonight, chipped in with some last-minute backstopping of my proofreader. Any remaining typos in the book are entirely their fault. Not here tonight, I also wish to acknowledge Donna Guest, Denny Lane, Chrysak Chunavan, Bill Klausner, and Bill Wharton. A special thanks to Jeffrey Race, who is here tonight, who hosted me during my visiting fellowship at Harvard, and whose work and example has very much inspired and informed my own. And as Dominic mentioned, my parents are in the house. Pay attention, Mom. Although about that, I must say that I have known American students who have come here for literally 2-month internships. Okay, summer internships, and whose parents have used the excuse to come over and see the sights and the sand and the sun. In my case, I had to live here for 15 years and write a book to get them on a plane. Okay, but I'm no less grateful for that, and of course for much more. I've prepared some substantive remarks for the evening, for which I encourage you to settle in, after which I welcome any questions. In 1972, American pilot Robert Himmel took off from Thailand's Utapao Air Base for a bombing run of North Vietnam. Struck by anti-aircraft fire over Hanoi, Himmel was able to fly back to Utapao, where he crashed in a ball of flames. All of his comrades perished, and while Himmel himself was pulled from the wreckage, he was burned so badly that a priest was summoned to perform the last rites. Himmel not only recovered, however, but flew again during the Persian Gulf War in 1991, again taking off from Utapao. But on 11 September 2001, while relocating his office from one part of the Pentagon to another, Himmel was one of 125 Americans killed when a plane flown by terrorists plowed into the building. While in no way reducing his service and sacrifice to mere symbolism, Himmel's story illustrates how US relations survived and even thrived after the divisive 1970s, only to falter needlessly at the turn of the century. When Himmel first took off in 1972, Thailand was playing host to 50,000 US servicemen, the second largest deployment outside the United States. Utapao was one of 7 such bases built by the Americans, as the US became the second largest employer in Thailand after the Thai government itself. Military aid peaked that year at $128 million, with economic assistance not far behind it, and not even accounting for untold amounts for and from the CIA. The wars in Indochina were, of course, the most proximate cause for these figures, but their roots lay in a previous conflict, when both during and after World War II, clever and creative US diplomacy ensured that Siam was seen and treated as an allied country. This was especially true as fascism in Japan was being replaced by communism elsewhere in the region, resulting in the multilateral Manila Pact in 1954 and the bilateral Tanat-Rusk Memo in 1962, both of which pledged the US to Thailand's defense in the event of a communist invasion. The founding of ASEAN in 1976 with deep American support was likewise, if implicitly, a response to communist influence and expansion. On the Thai side, equally deft diplomacy during World War II and successive military regimes bridged the two wars over a quarter century, as Thailand was keen to play the role of a teetering domino, even as it genuinely feared falling to internal or external communist aggression. During this period, and continuing decades thereafter, the Americans had no more steadfast an ally in Southeast Asia than Thailand's King Bhumibol, who was born in Boston, visited the US twice in the 1960s, and committed nearly 38,000 Thai troops to the wars in Indochina. And although President Nixon undertook his historic visit to China 11 months before Robert Himmel's plane was struck over Vietnam, the previous 3 decades of common cause between the US and Thailand would not have existed had Mao's communists not prevailed in that country's long civil war and outlasted Thai and US troops a year later in Korea. The two allies were joined in fear of a nation enormous in size and population, bordering mainland Southeast Asia, and offering a competing order and vision for the 20th century's latter half. On the ground in Thailand, a nascent China-sponsored insurgency assumed disproportionate concern, exacerbated by US propaganda and local xenophobia against an economically feisty Thai-Chinese population. Like our US pilot, Robert Himmel, the US-Thai alliance was gravely injured in the 1970s, but would likewise recover quickly. Nixon not only opened China to the US, but to the Thais as well, who in the course of 9 months officially recognized communist China and pointed to the door for all but a handful of US soldiers, one of whom I was able to interview for my book. They were tense times, not only between the two countries, but within them, as the US grappled with its first major military defeat, and the Thais grappled with major pro-democracy demonstrations, something the Americans had helped proactively suppress amidst its anti-communist crusade. A mid-career Anand Panirachun, also interviewed for my book, was intimately involved in both the American and Chinese affairs. Yet, despite the apparent reversal of fortunes between the US and China, alongside a seemingly gifted opportunity to succeed the US as Thailand's primary security guarantor, China failed to capitalize after Vietnam invaded neighboring Cambodia and threatened to be in Bangkok in time for lunch. While China did come to the defense of both Cambodia and Thailand, in the midst of its cultural revolution and economic struggles, it simply didn't have the wherewithal to move from security partner to strategic ally and thereby fill the void left by the Americans. This would not be the case 4 decades later. In Thailand, having watched monarchies fall violently to the communists in both Laos and Cambodia, the king was also in no mood to entrust the physical and ideological integrity of his kingdom to the Chinese. For their part, the Americans would use an enormous refugee crisis, the boat people, as a wedge issue toward prying their way back into Thailand and the regional security calculus. By the time President Reagan took office in Washington and General Prem did so in Bangkok in 1980, the US-Thai relationship was successfully reset for nearly 2 more decades, symbolized by the commencement 2 years later of the flagship Cobra Gold military exercises. In Beijing, Deng Xiaoping was focused far more on domestic modernization than on foreign policy. This too would not be the case several decades on. Indochina was famously turned from battlefields into marketplaces, thanks to Thai Premier Chatichai Chunavan, whose son Chrysak provided an insider's play-by-play for the book. Just after Robert Himmel flew in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, what my book labels the Thai Spring took place. A brief flowering of democratic zeal and governance that saw King Bhumibol at the apex of his authority and positive US influence in Thailand, likewise at an all-time high. No sooner did this spring culminate in the progressive 1997 Constitution, however, than the US and China both planted the seeds of their future engagement during the regional financial crisis the same year. A dogmatic, arrogant, and economically predatory US response contrasted with one by China described most recently by the ambassador to Washington as, quote, giving us reason to look east. Interviews with former Prime Minister Chuan Likpai and US Ambassador Richard Heckler provided perspective on this in my book. The century would thus end on somewhat uncertain terms, but by every metric and measure, politics, economics, military affairs, rights and governance, diplomacy, royal relations, soft power, regional dynamics, the United States was second to none in Thailand in its influence and its interests. All that changed in 2001. In addition to claiming Robert Himmel's life, the terrorist attacks that year would fix the attention of US President Bush firmly and exclusively on an ill-defined war for his entire 8 years in office. China's economic growth, steadying at a whopping 9% in 2001, was to reach an improbable 14.5% during the same period. And in Thailand, newly elected Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra proactively altered the orientation and trajectory of Thailand's foreign policy outside the American sphere of influence and into that of the Chinese. Unlike his domestic policies, the effects of this were not immediate or immediately appreciated at home, for he was working against a half-century of history. Yet once underway, the force and momentum of the shift worked directly against any reversal, even after the coup that eventually overthrew him. 2001 marked the end of the beginning for newly ascendant Sino-Thai relations and the beginning of the end for the US-Thai alliance. The most credible way to appreciate the breadth and depth of Thailand's seismic shift in foreign policy, begun under Thaksin and accelerating during the 11 subsequent years, is in fact to fast forward to what marked the end of the Thaksin era, namely the 2014 coup. On that day, Thailand's military relations with the US, the foundation of the alliance for 60 years, were essentially frozen in place, as the Americans withdrew military assistance, suspended their military education training, revoked a series of invitations to military and other security-related personnel, halted joint annual naval exercises already underway, canceled upcoming joint military army drills, and immediately planned to either cancel or significantly scale back the Cobra Gold exercises. The first and only senior defense dialogue since the turn of the century had taken place 2 years before. China, in contrast, prepared to stage the first joint Air Force exercises between the two countries, to sell the Thais 10 tanks and 3 submarines, and to develop in Thailand a joint weapons industry to facilitate increased procurement of Chinese arms. China and Thailand continued their annual defense meetings at the ministerial level, which had taken place uninterrupted since 2001. 3 months before the coup, in a move that defied explanation, China had, at the invitation of the United States, participated in Cobra Gold at the Observer Plus level for the first time. Economically, by the time of the coup, the US had fallen since 2001 from first to third on Thailand's list of trading partners, and second to fourth on its list of foreign investors. China had moved into first and second respectively, having barely registered on either list at the turn of the century. The US had fallen from first to fifth on ASEAN's list of trading partners, replaced at the top by China. Where the US had been responsible for a years-long global financial crisis and subsequent crisis in confidence in the American economic model, the Chinese had extended nearly $20 billion in credit, cash, or kind to ASEAN to lessen the damage. The US had been late in inviting Thailand to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Obama's flagship multilateral trade pact, and the Thais had responded with equal ambivalence, not least because the pact expressly excluded China, which became the world's largest economy the same year as the coup. The Thais were, however, founding members of China's new Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which comprised the world's largest free trade area and whose fourth round of negotiation had taken place a month before the coup. Politically, in the hours and days after the coup, the US issued statements roundly condemning it and calling for the release of political leaders, the reopening of media outlets, a return to democracy, respect for human rights, despite referring to a coup in Egypt 10 months before as, quote, an intervention to restore democracy. The Chinese did not issue a statement, as just 7 months before, China's premier had become the first foreign national to ever address Thailand's parliament in its 81-year history. None of the 6 US presidents who had visited Thailand, several more than once, had received such an honor. Diplomatically, on the day of the coup, the US response triggered a Thai social media campaign calling for the dismissal of US Ambassador Christy Kenny, whose term had already been extended for a year, and who was one of only 5 US service officers to hold the rank of career ambassador, and who was the first to hold that rank to run the Bangkok embassy for 30 years. Yet, almost as many years of US disinvestment in area studies, language training, and regional specialization revealed that a superior skill set was no substitute for substance. While Kenny departed 6 months later, the US would leave its embassy in Thailand without an ambassador for 11 months. In contrast, the Chinese embassy had, since the turn of the century, been led by what a former US ambassador referred to as, quote, Beijing's A-team, individuals who had spent multiple appointments in Thailand, spoke Thai fluently, and had not only foreign ministry clout, but connections or membership in the Communist Party. And neither was soft power able to make up the difference on the day of the 2014 coup, as the 3 American corners in Thailand were all that remained after its closure of the US Information Service in 1999 and the dissolution of American studies programs and American centers at Thai universities. While USAID maintained a number of programs on governance in Thailand's deep south, plagued by an Islamic insurgency, suspicion of CIA involvement or influence, however unfounded, was deeply persistent and widely held. Meanwhile, Thailand was host to at least 23 Confucius institutes or classrooms across the country, and Chinese studies programs at a half-dozen Thai universities. The number of Thai students enrolled in the US by the time of the coup had dropped by over 50% since the start of the century, and American students in Thailand numbered just over 1,000. Thailand and China had become each other's largest sources of foreign students, with at least 10,000 from each country trading places and ideas. American teachers in Thailand, in the Peace Corps and other programs, numbered in the hundreds, as the English language and critical thinking in Thai classrooms plateaued. There were some 3,000 Chinese teachers in the country, most paid by China to teach Mandarin. At the time of the 2014 coup, Thailand's King Bhumibol, so staunch a US ally as to be referred by Prince Chalermsuk as a, quote, American king, was no longer strong enough of mind or body to orient his kingdom's foreign affairs. He had not been to the United States for 47 years. Since the turn of the century, Queen Sirikit, the then Crown Prince, and Princess Sirantorn had each been to the United States one time. To China, however, Princess Sirantorn had been at least 20 times since the century began, receiving the country's inaugural Language, Culture, and Friendship Award in 2000, and named a Friendship Ambassador by China in 2004. She was fluent in Mandarin. Fellow Princess Chulaborn had likewise been named a Cultural Ambassador to China, having visited 3 times in 2009 alone. As a member of both Thaksin's and Yingluck's governments told me for this book, quote, the Americans were worried when I talked to them, but I don't think they had a strategy like the Chinese. Because having a strategy for Thailand means also having to deal with a monarchy, not only the superstructure, but the Crown Property Bureau. So if they really cared, they would talk to the palace. The Chinese got it. And geopolitically, on the day of the 2014 coup, a US Lower Mekong initiative was focusing on education, the environment, and public health, while China was shipping oil and rubber up a Mekong River whose depth and flow it had been manipulating for years, and was staging joint security patrols of that river in Thai territory. Where the US had just been denied use of Thailand's Utapao Air Base for strictly civilian flights to study climate change, China was financing a series of roads connecting its southernmost province with the Gulf of Thailand, and negotiating high-speed rail for the same. The US and Thailand had last had a strategic dialogue in 2012, their 4th since 2005, each resulting in a joint statement. China and Thailand were in the midst of a strategic partnership initially discussed in 2001, launched in 2005, covering cooperation in 15 areas through 2011, and expanded in 2012 to carry relations forward through 2016. 6 weeks after the coup, the 2 countries would hold a strategic dialogue in Beijing. Most notably, at the time of the 2014 coup, the Americans' acclaimed pivot to Asia, by then 3 years old, and with less than 3 years left in Obama's presidency, had amounted to several hundred Marines in northern Australia and a handful of naval ships to Singapore. Despite the US having called the Utapao Air Base the, quote, most important cooperative security location we have in all of the Asia Pacific, Thailand barely registered in the pivot. China's Xi Jinping, in contrast, in power for only a year and a half to that point, was developing and promoting a 21st century Silk Road and preparing to finance it with a new Asian infrastructure investment bank. This maritime Silk Road south of China hugs the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans through Southeast and South Asia and continues west along the maritime Middle East to the Red Sea. Thailand was and remains squarely and strategically incorporated. 2/3 of my book is devoted to how and why the situation I've just described came to be, relative to a very different situation at the end of the 20th century. I suppose I could just stop here and refer you to the table of books on sale at the back, but instead I would like to share just a few highlights or lowlights, facts and figures, quotes and vignettes that I think are emblematic or illustrative of the sea change that has taken place in Thailand's 2 most important foreign relationships. Stay with me, Mom. Perhaps the most important point to make is that while the change began under Thaksin, his successors, both his nominees and his opponents, did not alter or arrest the steady realignment of Thailand between the two global powers. The 5 premiers to follow Thaksin until the 2014 coup claimed policies as boldly different as the color of their supporters, yellow, green, red, and such was sometimes true domestically. But except for minor areas of emphasis, their foreign policies were oriented far more toward Beijing than toward Washington. And even where Thailand did, on occasion, attempt modest or temporary departures, it was stymied by the policies of those distant capitals. China's expansion of interests and influence was not to be denied. America's attention and priorities were not to be redirected. Thaksin famously parlayed his pre-existing business relationships and predilection for economic interests into China's first free trade agreement with any Southeast Asian nation. He told me in 2005, sooner or later, integration would happen, so why don't we go first? If we don't do it, someone else will do it, and we will lose competitiveness. So we had to do it now. We needed to be there first. The same month that deal was signed, US negotiations on a similar agreement began, but after 6 rounds over 4 years, it would founder under a lack of political will in Washington and political chaos precipitating Thailand's 2006 coup. Among the reasons was US insistence that its pharmaceutical industry should receive longer patents than required under WTO rules, and that Thailand not be allowed to violate patents on anti-HIV drugs in the interest of public health, which was in fact legally permitted. The former rekindled memories of US heavy-handedness during the 1997 financial crisis, while the latter was morally indefensible and a PR disaster. Upon resigning, Thailand's chief negotiator flatly told the American ambassador, "Nobody likes it, and nobody likes you." Much of the reversal in trade fortunes between China and the US in the years thereafter was on account of market share lost to China as a result of its FTA with Thailand and the lack thereof on the American side. On foreign direct investment, the Chinese invested heavily in northern Thailand, not coincidentally Thaksin's electoral base, both during and after his tenure. In its largest ever investment in Thailand, in 2010 it purchased the Asia Credit Bank, about which APICIT's finance minister Korn told me, quote, "Beijing clearly wanted a foothold in a strategic country in Asia." US companies, meanwhile, despite being afforded the same investment privileges and incentives as Thais, pursuant to a 40-year-old treaty, were deterred by the CNN effect of constant political disruption and their own self-inflicted financial crisis. Diplomatically, China's top-flight embassy was, on the one hand, balanced by a superlatively qualified US ambassador in Ralph Boyce, who brought to bear 8 years of previous experience in Thailand and an off-the-scale command of the Thai language. On the other hand, Boyce represented the last in a long line of individuals who collectively proved that international relations are often only as strong as the personal and professional relationships that give them meaning. Thailand's leaders were close to America because they were close to Americans. In the words of a current mid-career US diplomat, quote, "When I first got into government, all the people who followed Thailand at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the CIA, Pacific Command, were people who had done their service, fallen in love with Thailand, and then gone to work with the US government as civilians. They spent 30+ years as people who cared about the relationship, who understood a strategic commonality and were willing to invest personally. But by 2005 or so, most had retired or were gone." Despite all of this, a week before the 2006 coup, Secretary of State Rice requested a meeting with Ralph Boyce in Washington, planning to reassign him to none other than that vortex of American foreign policy, Afghanistan. Growing animated in describing this meeting during my interview with him, Boyce managed to stay put. Compounding this generational shift was another diplomatic own goal scored by the Americans just after Thaksin's departure. On account of growing danger in Iraq, the State Department guaranteed Foreign Service officers one of their top 5 choices for their next assignment in exchange for spending a single year in Baghdad. When a disproportionate number listed Thailand, however, as they had for decades, the department was forced to shorten the duration of their tenures from a typical 4 or 5 years to 2. 2007 thus became the final year during which US diplomats in Thailand had the time to invest in relationships, culture, language, knowledge. These 2-year rotations would last through the 2014 coup. I would note, however, that having liaised closely with many political officers at the embassy since this ill-advised policy took place, I have found them uniformly smart, committed, and concerned. And then there was just plain bad luck, whose ill effects would likewise multiply in the years that followed. Just after Thaksin was deposed, erstwhile private cables and conversations between the US Embassy and various Thai and other contacts, including your host, were made public via the WikiLeaks website. And as Dominic mentioned, during record snowfalls at Harvard in February of 2015, I reviewed over 3,000 of them, exposing information and opinions clearly understood by both parties as being more complete, sensitive, strategic, and candid than that intended for the public domain. The site uniquely damaged US-Thai relations. Since WikiLeaks sources were anonymous, it was impossible to know whether the documents had in fact been leaked by US officials or were the handiwork of a hacker. But as they were recorded and sent by US diplomats in Thailand to Washington, the Americans were seen as at least unwittingly complicit. That the conversations included Thailand's senior-most people and most delicate subjects made the breach all the more serious, as personal relationships were also strained. A Privy Councillor told me for this book, quote, "General Prem didn't take it too well. Before, if I went to see my boss, the CIA station chief would always be there chatting with him. I don't think he would be so warmly welcomed anymore, because the Thai leadership is afraid of speaking frankly to the Americans in case there are more leaks." While a senior embassy official did apologize to several contacts, WikiLeaks left a bitter aftertaste for many Thais and a diplomatic windfall for the Chinese. I began my interview with Thaksin Shinawatra by telling him frankly that I was describing his human rights record in my book as Thailand's worst since Field Marshal Sarit in 1957. He literally laughed that off, claiming that his critics had been citing human rights for a long time. Yet Thaksin's approach to governance, rights, and the rule of law took on a Chinese character, both in his adoption of the China model of authoritarian capitalism at home and his explicit support for Beijing's policies: Taiwan and One China, Tibet, the Falun Gong, the Muslim Uyghurs. And as with so much else, this continued under Thaksin's successors in their collective assault on freedom of expression, their heavy-handed response to the Southern insurgency, their use of sweeping and draconian legislation, their treatment of the Rohingyas and other refugees from Myanmar, their resort to violence, in opposition as well as in power, and often via their color-coded supporters. Recall Prime Minister Samak's roundups to ensure a smooth running of the Beijing-bound torch for the 2008 Olympics, as well as Prime Minister Apisit's use of live fire zones to disperse protesters. Recall, too, the demands for a coup by yellow shirts who saw elections as a threat to their inheritance, and the wanton destruction of property by red shirts who confused electoral success for the tyranny of the majority. I would not expect the following names to ring any bells: Abu Zubaydah of Palestine, Ramzi bin al-Shib of Yemen, Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed Nazir bin Lep of Malaysia, Abdul Hakim Belhad and his pregnant wife, Fatima Bukhar of Libya. These 6 persons were 6 of 9 suspects in the US war on terror who were sent during Thaksin's premiership to so-called black sites in Thailand for interrogation and torture by American intelligence agents. Thailand was in fact the first of at least 54 nations to participate in the CIA's program of extraordinary rendition, with likely black sites at an old signals base in Udon Thani, at the Utapao Air Base, and at Don Mueang Airport. Over a 4-day period, Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times. While a Foreign Service officer told me that she had seen the interrogation tapes in a US embassy safe, Thaksin himself told me, quote, "I don't know, but I heard that there was cooperation between security officers, that they allowed the CIA or FBI to investigate, to interrogate those we arrested. I really don't know what was going on, but after I left office, I heard that there was some cooperation at the working level, at the official level, that never came up to me at the political level." Taking command of the US Embassy several months after the last incident of torture, Ambassador Boyce likewise told me, "I don't know anything about black sites, because there weren't any on my watch, if there was such a thing going on. If there were sites, there were people running them, obviously, and who knew about them. But I didn't need to know because there weren't any when I was there." I don't know who knew what or when, but I do know that such torture would have been taken by Thaksin and or the Thai security forces as affording a freer hand in dealing with their own Islamic insurgency in the Deep South. And I know that American credibility in advocating human rights from that time through the 2014 coup was severely compromised, especially within the military and intelligence establishments that hold the longest and deepest links with the United States. I know this in small part for having investigated the use of torture against Muslim suspects in Thailand's southern insurgency for Amnesty International. Upon taking my findings to a senior military officer, he asked to see my passport before asking further what grounds I had for questioning Thailand's counterinsurgency methods. In terms of regional relations, Thaksin expressly characterized Thailand as China's gateway to ASEAN and was a driving force in getting Beijing to sign both a free trade agreement with the region and the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, as well as agree to a regional strategic partnership. Subsequent years saw the first China-ASEAN joint military exercises, which by 2009 gave China its 48th mechanism through which to engage the regional body. In 2012, Thailand offered to mediate Beijing's disputes in the South China Sea with several other ASEAN states in order to avoid taking a side. Cleverly, the Thais have retained that mediation role. Such that the foreign ministry official told me for this book, Thailand prides itself in this role, and we also see an opportunity in it. Thailand has a special relationship with China. Outside of ASEAN, Thaksin devised several new pieces of Asian architecture that featured or focused on China, including the Asia Cooperation Dialogue and a bilateral currency swap that was a direct Asia for Asians response to how the US had handled the 1997 financial crisis. During America's own financial crisis, beginning in 2008, China multilateralized that currency swap and so helped shield the region from some of its effects. Thaksin did not invite the US to join the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, which had 18 founding members and has 34 today. The Bush administration skipped the ASEAN Regional Forum twice in 3 years, expressly on account of the War on Terror, and twice postponed the 30th anniversary US-ASEAN Summit. When the Obama administration finally signed the ASEAN Treaty in 2009, it was 6 years after the Chinese had signed, and it afforded the US only its 8th mechanism, 40 fewer than China, with which to engage the regional body. In terms of soft power, Thaksin and China were gifted a perfectly timed domestic phenomenon in Thailand. Following 4 decades of upward mobility within and across sectors of society, the Thai Chinese were ready to lead the nation. Thaksin utilized his own Chinese heritage and that of his cabinet to great effect, seen not only in the education and language that I noted before, but also in popular tourism, trendy ancestral visits to China, a noticeably increased presence of Chinese media in Thailand, flashy embassy-funded celebrations of both the Chinese New Year and Royal Thai birthdays in Chinatown, and a pair of hugely popular baby pandas. A 2005 US Embassy survey revealed that the number of Thais believing China would soon become their most important external influence had risen from 12% in 1998 to a majority. The same year, the US closed its consulate in southern Thailand, which promptly became a Chinese consulate. In a head-shaking piece of irony, in 2009, a Northeastern Thai university's courses on American history and foreign policy were both being taught by Chinese teachers with salaries paid by the Chinese government. And in 2010, another opinion poll indicated that 70% of Thais ranked China as the kingdom's closest friend. Thaksin had a famously contentious relationship with the palace, and indeed the only time he asked me to go off the record during my interview was in discussing the monarchy. But this did not keep the Chinese from making deeper inroads via the king's privy council and the palace itself. Thereafter, in 2009, China would name a cultural institute after Princess Sirantorn, build a residence for her outside of Beijing, and fund the construction of several northern Thai university buildings, also named after her and devoted to Chinese studies. A poll in China that year named Princess Sirantorn the country's second most important international friend. Although President Obama would later meet with King Bhumibol in an attempt to make amends, US-Thai royal dynamics post-Thaksin were most starkly illustrated in 2008, when a visiting President Bush failed, after heavy foreign ministry lobbying, to arrange a meeting with the king, who was at his seaside palace in Hua Hin. Government sources said that Hua Hin's airport lacked the runway facilities to accommodate the president's plane. A half-century past in Thailand, Herculean logistical efforts had been made to accommodate not only planes, but firm geopolitical priorities. Recognizing further that the monarch who had enabled those efforts was the one still residing in a seaside palace, the failure of a US president to meet him was truly profound. For a king in the twilight of his reign, President Bush could not, would not, bridge the distance equal to that between Washington and Philadelphia. A year later, as both sides of Thailand's deepening political crisis were accusing the United States of interference, the embassy mistakenly played Thailand's national anthem rather than its royal anthem at a large US Embassy Independence Day reception. I was at the event myself and barely noticed, but nearly every one of the Thais I interviewed for this book, of all colors and stripes, mentioned it years later. And finally, military relations, which invariably implicate not only the coup that overthrew Thaksin, but also the one that deposed his sister Yingluck 8 years later. In appointing General Chavalit as his first defense minister, Thaksin signaled clearly the direction he wished to go, given Chavalit's long history with China. In fact, when the Chinese had briefly invaded Vietnam in 1979, they had allowed General Chavalit to fire the first symbolic cannon. The first military exercises of any kind between China and a Southeast Asian country were Sino-Thai naval exercises in the Andaman Sea in 2004 and in the Gulf of Thailand in 2005, followed by joint search and rescue drills in 2006. The geopolitical implications of these, even a decade ago, were considerable. In 2006, the Chinese were caught unaware by the coup that overthrew Thaksin. Their ambassador was immediately, if temporarily, recalled to Beijing. According to US Ambassador Boyce, however, China's military attaché told him, quote, "I look at US military sanctions as an opportunity to expand influence. In my approach of telling the Thais that we will be here long term, we will not interfere in your affairs, will give me a leg up on my American counterparts." And so it was. Just months after the coup, China gave Thailand $41 million for military use, signed a joint security action plan, and substantially increased the number of Thai officers eligible to attend Beijing's National Defense University. That year also saw Strike 2007, the first joint military exercises with any nation involving China's special forces, followed by Strike 2008 in Thailand, which marked the first time Chinese forces trained anywhere on foreign soil. 2 more years of those drills were joined in 2010, 2012, and 2013 by the incredibly strategic Blue Strike maritime exercises involving both nations' navies and Marine Corps. Thaksin's military relationship with the US was, of course, dominated by Bush's war on terror. In the war in Afghanistan, Thaksin initially refused to commit Thai troops and denied the Americans use of the Utapao Air Base, which our pilot Robert Himmel, killed just 26 days earlier, had known very well. Thaksin did the same the following year after the US invasion of Iraq. In both cases and on both issues, he relented under pressure. Foreign Minister Kantati provided considerable insight into these dynamics for my book. Thaksin also captured the Indonesian terrorist responsible for the bombing buildings of the Bali bombings, rather, of 2002, and agreed to exempt Americans in Thailand from the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, which I believe, but cannot prove, was related to the CIA's torture program. For these efforts, Thailand was granted by the US the status of a major non-NATO ally, about which Thaksin told me during my interview, quote, "I don't care, because nothing happened. We felt proud we had been granted major non-NATO status because we supported in Iraq, but nothing happened, really. I still don't know, even now, what is the benefit of major non-NATO status." More broadly, and to my point, was Thaksin's first foreign minister, Surikiart, who said to me, quote, "My first year was 9/11, my second year Afghanistan, my third year Iraq, my fourth year Iraq. And then between the war, weapons of mass destruction, anti-terrorism dialogue, intelligence cooperation, the arrest of Hambali, where were the other issues? Where was China?" The section in my book on the US in the 2006 coup is among the most intriguing, involving elephant riding in Chiang Mai, General Sirayud in his pajamas, and a helpless Thaksin in a New York hotel room. I was still at the UN, Thaksin told me, and the next day George Bush delivered a speech about democracy in the General Assembly. But he never mentioned the coup d'etat in Thailand. It looked like the Americans felt good that I had been ousted. He never mentioned it. Pursuant to US law, the Americans suspended, canceled, rescinded, and reviewed an array of military activities and initiatives, and conditioned their renewal on various human rights improvements and the holding of elections within a year. Most of this duly occurred. Martial law was lifted, Thailand held elections within 15 months, and the US restored full mill-to-mill relations. In the inter-coup years, Apisit's foreign minister Kasit would rightly complain about procurement from the US, expressly attempting to balance the Thai military's increasing attraction to Chinese weapons and materiel. He was told in 2009 that US excess defense articles, to which major non-NATO allies are entitled, would not be available until 2014. He recounted to me a conversation he had with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I told Clinton, quote, "We should have better things than the Burmese or the Malaysians. You cannot say that we should get the same things as the underlings. We should get something quite good, near what you give Taiwan, South Korea, Israel, or even the Egyptian military." There was some sort of fear that Thailand would have the overall priority over neighboring countries. And why not? We're the bloody allies. On the other hand, the inter-coup years would also see the US and Thailand commence new joint army exercises in 2012, focusing on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This was a natural outgrowth of 3 events to which the US military had admirably responded: the 2004 Pacific tsunami, Myanmar's Cyclone Nargis in 2008, and Thailand's devastating floods in 2011. Incidentally, Thailand's response to the tsunami was led by none other than Lieutenant Colonel Chalermsuk. The link between the 2006 coup and the coup of 2014, from a Thai perspective, has been well analyzed. The basic argument being that it was the first coup's failure to rid Thailand not only of Thaksin, but of the Thaksin era that made the second coup necessary. A similar argument holds for the United States, namely that its failure to respond strongly and strategically in 2006 left the door open for Thailand's military to repeat itself more forcefully 8 years later. While the US response in 2006 was handled and communicated far more effectively by Ambassador Boyce than was the case in 2014 under Ambassador Kenny, the substance was largely the same. The key difference being that the US had far more leverage the first time than the second. Thailand experienced in 2006 what I refer to in my book as the last American coup, on account of a generation gap in the Thai military that became most apparent in its wake. By 2014, Thailand's generals were looking far more to China for example, guidance, and support than to the United States. As my parents are now regretting having paid my law school tuition, I will conclude by briefly asking what all of this means and what might be done. Since the beginning of the new century, the United States has alternated between two mutually exclusive sets of priorities in Thailand. Under elected governments, the US has focused largely on its traditional national interests: diplomatic engagement, political agreements, military training, economic growth, which collectively attest to Thailand's geopolitical importance. Under military governments, the US has focused almost entirely on its foreign policy values: democratic governance, human rights, the rule of law, which collectively attest to Thailand's role in the global community and under international law. Neither one of these approaches has been effective. Thailand's geopolitical significance has gone largely unrecognized and unaccounted for. And if the needle on rights and governance in Thailand has moved at all since the recent coup, it has not been on account of condemnatory statements from Washington or attempts to isolate a nation in a world in which isolation is no longer an option. This is not a coincidence. The separation of US values and US interests is rather the cause for the lack of success in either area. For proof of this, look no further than China. It is not a coincidence that its geopolitical gains in Thailand since the turn of the century have come as Thailand has more and more resembled its approach to pluralism, dissent, and transparency. This is not to say that China cannot deal effectively with democracies, but that just as the US finds it easier to advance its interests in nations whose system of governance it recognizes and respects, so does China fare better with governments it understands. And to influence foreign countries, instead of issuing demands, China demonstrates that economic growth can be sustained. Instead of publicly criticizing policies, it privately convinces that social order is preferable to protests and elections. Instead of conditioning its engagement, it engages at an ever deeper and broader level towards securing its foundations. That is, contrary to both conventional wisdom and Chinese claims, China does not refrain from interfering in the domestic affairs of other nations. Its China model of authoritarian governance, backed by a market economy, directly contributes to its geopolitical ambitions. Conversely, the more impressive those ambitions become, the world's largest economy, a blue water navy, a 20th century Silk Road, 21st century Silk Road, the more attractive the China model becomes. Rather than being mutually exclusive, Chinese values and Chinese interests are mutually enforcing. Rather than a series of reactive tactics and transactions that has characterized US policy in Southeast Asia, China's approach has been proactively comprehensive and strategic. At first glance, it would appear that President Trump understands this, and that by inviting Thailand's military premier to Washington last month, that he's shaking things up a bit. Impelled by geopolitical tension on the Korean Peninsula, he is re-engaging a treaty ally despite its non-democratic credentials. But a closer look reveals that Trump has not simply added US national interests to a conversation dominated for 3.5 years by US values, but has seemingly dropped those values in the process. Not to mention that North Korea isn't the issue, given that Thailand has supported the US position there since 1950 and is not being forced to choose between the US and China. The issue is that Thailand is situated on the map between the narrow Straits of Malacca on the west from the resource-rich South China Sea to the east. Through these straits passes 1/3 of global trade and 2/3 of all oil and liquefied natural gas, and even higher percentages of what China exports and consumes. The South China Sea hosts competing territorial claims between China and 5 Southeast Asian nations, and its northernmost point is Taiwan. The problem for China is that its southwestern region closest to this hotspot is landlocked, and that the Straits of Malacca, on which its military economy therefore depends, is effectively controlled by the US Navy's 7th Fleet. If either the South China Sea or Taiwan, or both, were to trigger a crisis or conflict, China could be hindered by the US in its ability to move ships, soldiers, and supplies through these narrow straits. Thailand is not a claimant in the South China Sea, and it has consistently refused to side with its neighbors, pledging a neutrality that is welcomed by China. And as I mentioned earlier, it has also been a strict adherent to Beijing's One China policy on Taiwan. If China were to precipitate a conflict tomorrow with Vietnam over the Paracel Islands, with the Philippines over the Spratlys, or with Taiwan, all of which would implicate the United States, which way would Thailand tip? And if such a crisis were to occur 10 years from now, Thailand might have already tipped via a canal. And if such a crisis were to occur 10 years from now, Thailand might have already tipped via just the sort of connectivity project that China has utilized for a decade to expand its reach. A canal across Thailand's narrow southern isthmus of Kra would allow China to bypass the Straits of Malacca, thereby placing it on more equal terms with the US in the Indo-Pacific. Should China finance, build, and control such a canal in a manner comparable to the US and Panama a century ago, and I believe that it will, then Thailand will have proven its geopolitical importance to at least one of 2 global powers. Trump's approach to Thailand is doomed to failure, no less than the one it has replaced, and for the same reasons. Until and unless the Americans begin to place their foreign policy values neither above nor below their national interests, but squarely within an all-encompassing geopolitical equation, they will lose on both fronts. Finally, even this approach will fail if what the Americans are offering is not simply different from the China model, but qualitatively better. In order for democratic governance, civil liberties, and the rule of law to be a means toward the achievement of other national interests, they must be shown, first and foremost in the United States, to be more responsive to the needs and desires of citizens than the authoritarian capitalism being quietly exported by Beijing. Otherwise, the US becomes just another camp in a purely quantitative competition for resources and power. There is no dignity in that, and there is no future in it either. In a way that it could not do prior to the turn of the century, China is now offering Thailand, the region, and beyond a viable alternative to the post-war global order that the US established and maintained for 70 years. And reference alone to neither defense treaties nor human rights treaties is going to change that. The first American ambassador to Thailand, Edwin F. Stanton, concluded in 1950 that, quote, "No matter what we do now in Southeast Asia, the game is lost." He was stupendously wrong for an entire half century, until the day our pilot, Robert Himmel, perished in the Pentagon. One hopes that I'm not the only American to have read Stanton's memoirs, and that Himmel's legacy is not an alliance squandered. Thank you for your extended attention.
Right, well, as usual, we have a microphone in the middle of the floor, so if you'd like to ask a question, queue up. Please identify yourselves, avoid statements, and keep it short and focused.
George McLeod. First of all, you seem to be saying that the Thai elite have been moving much closer to the PRC over the past few decades. My impression has always been actually that the Thai government is quite hostile to China despite the rhetoric. Would you not agree that the PRC has basically stripped Thailand of its light manufacturing sector and is economically is a major competitor to this country? And secondly, you seem to be arguing that the Chinese model is leading Thailand to a more authoritarian style of government. Would you not agree, though, that the most hardline dictatorships in Thailand were during times of U.S. influence, like in the 1970s? I mean, ultimately, you seem to be saying that the U.S. influence here is benign, but why then is it that the U.S. support for Thailand has been at its height during the most hardline dictatorships in Thailand? Thanks.
Thank you. Look, on the one hand, it's true that China and China and Thailand compete, and until about the middle of the 1980s, or maybe even the middle of the 1990s, rather, Thailand was growing exponentially faster than the Chinese. Right, that really just began to flip right at the turn of the century when China's economic growth was skyrocketing, right after the financial crisis that temporarily ruined Thailand's economic growth. So things since then basically have flipped. There's definitely a great deal of dissent in Thailand among the elite as well as within the Thai population to the increasing dominance of China. Look, the Mekong River, which I mentioned, the dredging of the river, the deepening of the river for increased boats moving northward, the manipulation of the river levels by way of dams in China. And the FTA that was negotiated in the early part of the 2000s was extremely detrimental to Thai garlic farmers, Thai apple farmers, Thai rice farmers to a certain extent. And it did embolden and sort of enliven an anti-Chinese sentiment. Krisek Chunavan explains this a great deal in the book, and he was one of the leading sort of opponents of some of this that was happening at the time. And it's one of the things, frankly, that doomed the U.S.-Thai free trade agreement because of what had happened vis-a-vis local Thai farmers in the Thai-Chinese context. But my overall feeling is that Thaksin went where the going was good. Right? I mean, his ideologue and his chief advisor, Pansak, said to me, look, we knew what way the wind was blowing. Like, we had to get out in front of this. One way or another, the Chinese were going to be moving to its near abroad, right, to the warm water to the south. And if we didn't get out in front of that, create a host of sort of new East Asian architecture in order to control that or at least facilitate it, we were just going to be railroaded. Right, and the danger, I think, for Thailand at the time, I mean, whatever you may think of Thaksin, a visionary he was. He had some idea of where things were headed, especially from an economic standpoint, and I think he could see the alternative, and he told me this in the interview, was akin to Laos or Cambodia. Right, at this point in time, China controls 20% of the Cambodian coast, and Laos is a veritable client state of the Chinese. Right, so I think, and I'm now suddenly painfully aware that one of Thaksin's foreign ministers is sitting in front of me, that he was attempting to sort of make the most of a situation economically. And at this point in time, I think the ship has sailed. I mean, whether or not the Thais are resentful of the Chinese economic dominance or feel that in one way or another it's an unequal relationship, the fact of the matter is it's not equal. So I think that's just the reality the Thais are going to have to deal with. Your point about U.S. influence is an excellent one, and it's one that I make much more explicit in the book. Certainly, and I guess I referenced it in my talk, that certainly when the U.S. presence here was at its height through the mid-1970s, the previous 25 years were among the worst for democratic development, human rights, and the rule of law in Thailand, primarily because the United States' geopolitical priorities in repelling communism made all of those things secondary at best, and in most cases completely jettisoned them altogether. But I think the balance started to tip by the 1990s. Again, that era I refer to in my book as the Thai Spring was when the U.S.-Thai relationship was at its most positive, and frankly at its most it wasn't as involved as it had been previously. Clinton came in 1995, President Clinton came here in 1995, and by then, in the middle of the 1990s, civil society had begun to take off. Thailand's economy began to grow. It was the Pax Americana, right? It was between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11 that happened 5 or 6 years later. So the 1990s, I think, were a time when U.S. influence here was sort of reset and made much more positive. It was then Thaksin and all of his successors that began to grow in their attraction and their adoption of the China model. Yeah, thank you.
When you write a book, you go into a production period, you stop writing, the editors take over. That's usually about 6 to 9 months ahead. Since you stopped writing the book, have things changed? Has the story moved on? What has changed? Do you regret anything that you have in the book?
No, I mean, I cut the book off at 2014 with the coup, and part of that was just the impossibility of writing a book in real time, right, and keeping up with events as they're developing. Part of it was also just the need to have a cutoff date. I mean, Dominic, full disclosure here, Dominic has just finished a book himself. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. But I do think, and actually, I started writing the book before the 2014 coup. I really thought I was sort of onto something, onto this sort of interesting new, sneaky idea about this changing of alliances. And of course, once the coup happened, so much of what I was researching and thinking became so much more apparent. And I think post-coup, the trajectory that I outlined from, let's say, 1997 or perhaps 2001 up until the coup has only actually accelerated. I don't think Trump's recent meeting with Prayut, it's just too early to say whether or not that's a game changer or whether that's just a one-off event.
Can you use the microphone? If you don't use the microphone, it doesn't get picked up on the recording, so that people who are watching it later have no idea what the question was. So there is quite a good practical reason.
Jeffrey Race, you've focused on the 3 state actors, China, the United States, and Thailand. Let your imagination run riot on some other actors. You've well described in your book, which I've read, the train wreck, which is American foreign policy in this region. In fact, this is a paradisical state compared to what we can see is coming, which is essentially the dissolution of the United States' ability to be an effective actor. How does that, what implications does that have for other actors like other states in the region or other parts of the world, for private businesses, for NGOs, for journalists, or for any other actor? This is really the big thing that's happening in the world right now. Tell us about some of the implications beyond the 3 actors you discussed.
Right. Well, there is a strong case to be made that Asia's economic growth post-World War II, through arguably the present day and certainly through the end of the 20th century, was enabled by the United States via the Marshall Plan in Japan, via its willingness to see Thailand as an allied country during World War II, and the exponential growth of the US Navy, particularly the deployment of its 7th Fleet to this part of the world, has in many ways enabled the economic growth in the region to be what it has been. In some ways, the United States patrolling of the South China Sea, the Western Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, protecting freedom of navigation, and deterring attacks between and among countries, in some ways has facilitated China's meteoric economic growth. So the more the US disengages from the region, and I think President Obama's pivot was strikingly well conceived. I mean, if you read Hillary Clinton's 2011 article in Foreign Policy magazine in which the pivot is articulated, it's an impressive article, it's an impressive document. But the trouble with the pivot was that once he announced it, there was a certain political cost that was immediately incurred. China was immediately alarmed by the announcing of the pivot, and that was entirely foreseeable. The trouble is that by announcing a pivot and incurring a political cost, but then not actually pivoting, not actually moving, means that the US was never able to exert any kind of benefit from that pivot. And I think what we're seeing with Trump is that on the one hand, he has been far more engaged in Asia than Obama was. I mean, but for better or for worse, whether it be North Korea, whether it be China, he's welcomed, I believe, 4 heads of government from Southeast Asia in his first year in office to Washington. And of course, his most recent trip to Asia that was colorful, to say the least. But his first year has been far more Asia-centric, I think, than Obama's was. But having said that, his policies of disengagement, his policies of America first, a slightly isolationist policy, and one in which he's basically ceding a leadership role by the US to the Chinese, I think is going to have enormous implications. Because if what I started out by saying is true, that the US has been a key actor in allowing Asia to grow economically and stay, for the most part, peaceful, minus internal armed conflicts and a number of small skirmishes, then the absence of US engagement in the region, I think, creates a vacuum that the Chinese are only willing to fill.
Spare you a walk to the microphone. Sean, can you wait?
Well, the president has asked me to be over here. It's quite an elevation. I'm Vivat Mungkandi for several years with Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Well, I have met briefly with a distinguished speaker. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the title of the book. What I like to comment is your thesis of Thai is leaning to China. That's correct. But what has it brought to this point? See, United States has lost more than 2 decades busying at somewhere else after the winning of the Cold War. President Clinton with the expansion of NATO, President Bush was Iraq and the Middle East, and President Obama with the several democracy and human rights issues, human security issue as well. While China is investing incrementally and quite successfully. But what I would like to add is that with the coming of the new administration in the United States, with America First policy, and with introspective orientation, and with tension with North Korea, Japan has been urged to take a more active role, not only to North Korea, but to the mainland Southeast Asia, which is vital to China in as much as to Japan. So it's quite logical that with Japan playing the active role, and United States will try to rally some other Asian allies around China to be more alert to the rising China or the rising hegemon of China, or to prevent it. Then with United States supporting from the back, from behind. So the whole thing is that I think that United States trying to balance the power to China as it has been doing all along its history since the open door policy. In that case, I think the new scenario is emerging. It's not really US-China rivalry, as you said in your title, the shifting ground, but perhaps the ground is shifting between Japan and China. And with this emerging scenario, it perhaps will allow Thailand to play a balancing act between Japan and China. This doesn't mean that your analysis was incorrect. It is correct. But a new scenario is emerging, and Thailand will be fortunately to be able to play a balancing act along with some other perhaps middle power, other middle powers countries and ASEAN countries as well.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wiwat. I've read most of what you've written, and I'll do my best to respond. Your question really relates to Japan, and one of the first people I interviewed for the book was Kun Amar Siamwala, who's one of Thailand's he's retired now, but one of Thailand's most preeminent economists. And the first thing he said to me during the interview was that he didn't have a whole lot of respect for foreign policy because he thought it was too inexact a discipline, which I thought was pretty rich coming from an economist. But the second thing he said to me is, you're writing the wrong book. I mean, he said we choose our own bosses in Thailand, and we chose Japan a long time ago. So you really ought to be writing a book on Thailand-Japanese relations. I'm not qualified to do so, but I think what you've pointed out, Doctor, is extremely true. And I do implicate Japan in my book, at least insofar as it was seen either by the Americans or by the Chinese or by the Thais as being a US ally that could at times play a role in the region that the US simply wasn't well enough placed to play or was not comfortable in playing. Again, Anand Panjarachun, Thailand's former prime minister, whom I interviewed, he was constantly encouraging the Americans, especially during the Obama administration, to work more with the Japanese. The Japanese are Asian, the Japanese are here. The Japanese economic investments in Thailand are exponentially higher than the Chinese and the Americans combined, right? And have been so. And yet the Japanese are not seen by the Thais as being nearly as threatening, nearly as dogmatic, nearly as outspoken as the Americans. They've often taken a fairly similar position. In the wake of the 2014 coup, for example, and the 2006 coup, the Japanese more or less fell behind the US position, but simply did it in such a way that was far more palatable than the Thais. So I take your point about a role for Japan. I have it in the book, but not to the extent that it probably should be. So thank you.
Right, Sean, you've been very patient.
Quite unlike myself. First and foremost, congratulations, Benji. We're all very proud of you. This is a shining moment for you. I'm very happy for you.
Thank you.
But of course, you got some things wrong. No, I'd like to ask you to speak a bit more, obviously, on what's not in the book and what you mentioned in your closing comments. I did an article for The Diplomat about 2 years ago, and the title was Thailand's Foreign Policy, Omnidirectional or Directionless? And the point I was making is that historically, and it was somewhat curious, I thought, in all of your presentation, not once did you mention this notion of bamboo in the wind, right? You know, playing one off the other, as Thailand historically has done and survived as a result amongst various great power competitions over the centuries. And so I wonder somewhat, you know, you've made the case that it seems in the book that, you know, perhaps all is lost, and that we are steaming towards, you know, Thailand becoming China's next client state. But just in some of my reporting, and what really set off the foreign ministry in that article was the notion that they are still playing their balancing act, and that although China has made extraordinary inroads, I mean, this was a balance that needed to be restruck, right? That there was this American dominance for so long, and with China rising, there needed to be a rebalancing. But since the coup, you know, if you look at what's actually happened on the ground, there's a lot that China hasn't gotten that it's wanted, right? Where is our high-speed train? I was just at a One Belt, One Road seminar just last week where the Chinese representative from some central commission or another was pleading with the Thais for greater strategic coordination, and could you at least just lay a couple of lines down or a couple kilometers to make it look like this thing's actually going to happen, right? And so, you know, when you speak to the Thais in private, you know, people in the Prime Minister's office, and obviously, yes, there was you know, much loss of face, you know, with the position that Kenny and the Obama administration took on rights after the coup. They're desperate for the U.S. to come back in the game, right? They don't want to lean this way so heavily to China. And so the notion that the Thais would actually allow the Kra Canal to happen, I mean, that would, as you mentioned, right? That's the big deal. That's when it's game over, right? And so you've seen, even with the sub deal, right, that if those Chinese subs were purchased or actually going to park at Satahib, the U.S. will leave. Right? They can't allow Chinese technicians to listen to the whir of the engines of their vessels that are there, right? And so I just wonder if you really, since the coup, if you've had any reassessment that recognizing that Thailand is still trying to play this balancing act, and that perhaps things like the Kra Canal and the high-speed train aren't going to happen.
Right. I mean, look, you make a great point, Sean, but my answer will in some ways recall my responses to George's question earlier, that first of all, I've never put much stock in this notion that Thailand bends with the winds. My position is that Thailand goes where it is pushed. It does not, I mean, I think the notion that Thailand bends with the wind and practices some sort of bamboo diplomacy gives Thailand a greater agency between the two global powers than it actually has. And that's regrettable. I don't celebrate the you know, ping pong dynamic of two global powers working a middle power or a small country to their ends. But I do think if you look at the 20th century, at least through the mid 70s when the Americans were shown the door, Thailand didn't so much decide that it wanted to be in that camp versus the Chinese camp, so much as the Americans said, you're going to be. And I think that's analogous to what's happening in the 21st century. And two things are happening here. That one, the Chinese will not be denied. So it is not the Thais' right to gift itself, so to speak, to say no. Especially when, as you also point out, despite the fact that Thais are, as you said, desperate for more American leadership, for a greater American presence, the Americans are simply not engaging at the level at which that would have an effect upon the Chinese. So again, it's a book about three countries, and one of the reasons this seismic shift in Thailand's trajectory has taken place is because all three of those countries have fallen in line. It's been a perfect storm of an overwhelming, relentless Chinese rise, an equally overwhelming retreat by the Americans to the Middle East and elsewhere, despite the pivot that was more like a shuffle, and starting with Thaksin, a prime minister who was proactively looking to go where the going was good. And at this point, look, I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic, right? I'm not optimistic, i.e. something, when I look at the evidence, I don't see reason to be optimistic. And so yeah, I have certainly spoken to Thais since the coup who say to me, knowing that I'm American or know I'm writing the book or what have you, that we could use you on the Mekong, for example. We could really use you there. This U.S. Lower Mekong Initiative, great that it's focusing on the environment and ecology and public health and a bit of infrastructure, but the Chinese have got armed patrols on the Mekong. They're blasting the Mekong River to make sure they can ship dual-use rubber and oil north to feed their economy and feed their military economy. And the Thais just don't have the wherewithal, and ASEAN can never speak with a single voice. So they're looking for Americans for leadership on that and for a presence. But until and unless one of those things changes, or at least one of those two things changes, i.e. the Chinese side or the American side, you can characterize it as bending in the wind or being pushed, but one way or another, there's not going to be middle ground for Thailand.
Right, we have an unusual situation. We have a former foreign minister in the audience, Dr. Thaksin Shinawat's second foreign minister, Supamongkong Kantati. Yes. So would you like to use the microphone? I don't usually do this, but...
Well, Benjamin, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for your substantial research. I enjoyed talking to you before during the interviews, and I wasn't actually planning to speak, make any comments tonight, but I thought you have stimulated me a little bit, and I will be as short as I can. Several points came to mind, and I wanted to share with you and our audience what actually went through my mind and our minds during those years. I think one thing to keep in mind is the fact that we did open the doors more towards the Chinese, but you have to look at where we were during the Vietnam War. So it was absolutely pro-American, and so the move towards China had to do, of course, with the feeling that the U.S. was paying attention elsewhere, the U.S. was not really engaged, but we intentionally wanted to have a balance. And so we moved towards the Chinese from a position of very pro-American, but remain engaged. So I think the word balance, the balancing act continues. So we did not feel that we were actually jumping into the Chinese camp, but be in the middle, look at opportunities to work with the Chinese, but we would welcome U.S. engagement always. Now, we actually became a U.S. ally with the Manila Pact. And so since we are not in Europe, not in NATO, I guess, that was how we became known as a non-NATO U.S. ally. So it's probably just that, that's why we have that terminology. ACD, you mentioned in passing. ACD was the Asia Cooperation Dialogue. So you mentioned in passing that we excluded the U.S. That is true, but it wasn't because we wanted to exclude the U.S. It was because ACD was designed as a first forum, which was and continues to be Asia-wide. So Asia-wide meaning East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, all the way to the Middle East, the continental Asia, including Qatar and others, Saudi Arabia. So that was why the US wasn't included. So it wasn't because we didn't want the US in particular, so it was a geographical situation. Troops in, we were invited to send troops to Iraq. We did the first time. Second time we didn't, and that was, I was personally involved there. And the reason there, as it was the same reason before, but we kind of did allow some Thai troops to go. It wasn't because of US-China situation, but it was because of the situation in the southern part of Thailand. That we thought that to be sending troops to Iraq would aggravate the situation in the southern part of Thailand. And I explained that personally to Secretary Rice, and she understood, and we helped in other ways. So that was what happened then. As far as South China Seas, you mentioned we're neutral. We actually did not follow a policy of neutrality in the South China Seas. What we did was that, first of all, we became the ASEAN's engaging partner with the Chinese, because that was a revolving situation. So it moves from us to other countries now. And so that, it's true that we have no claims in the South China Seas, but nevertheless, unlike maybe Cambodia, we adhere strictly to ASEAN's position. We would not want to see bilateral negotiations. We'd like to see multilateral negotiations, and we just wanted to be helpful, but not really neutral in that sense of the word. And at the, I guess to conclude, I would say that we would continue to like to see U.S. engagement as much as possible. And so the thought of us moving too close to the Chinese, I think, would frighten us to a degree. So it's in the middle somewhere, but pursuing Thai national interests. And the final thought, you mentioned Mekong. We have been resisting the fact that the Chinese have been asking us to allow Chinese armed police to come into Thai territories on the Mekong River. And they did so with the Laotians allowed that. We continue to resist that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Very direct feedback. Since nobody's going to ask a question I can see, I'll just put one in quickly. When you were doing the book, did you dwell on the cultural affinity between Thailand and China, Mother China? Because when Kukrit went there in 1975, established the relations, he played very heavily on this. If you look at Bangkok, it's a Sino-Thai city. All the main conurbations in Thailand are Chinese, basically. Did you make much of that in your book?
I did. I traced the role in which the domestic Sino-Thai played rather in this movement, you know, to and away or toward or closer to the Chinese. The Sino-Thai until about the turn of the century weren't always raising their head above the parapet. Right, I mean, going back, as I do in the book, all the way to the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, to be Sino-Thai in Thailand was something you would have been wise to keep under wraps. On account of the xenophobia that I mentioned, the Thais were the Chinese in Thailand were expressly referred to as the Jews of the Orient, quote unquote, because of their the dominant role they played as the engine of Thailand's economy. And so there was a lot of prejudice against the Sino-Thai up until about the turn of the century. And again, as I mentioned tonight, Thaksin really was gifted a domestic phenomenon by which, on the one hand, China itself was rising and growing at an exponential rate, which caught the world's attention. At the same time that, thanks to the ending of money politics, formally speaking, in Thailand in the 1990s, that allowed the Chinese to move out of professions that had been dominated by them and into professions that had up till that point been prohibited for them, meant that the Sino-Thai, by the time Thaksin came into power, were, as I said, ready to lead the country. And Thaksin himself really embodied this. He was a hugely successful businessman, and at the same time was a lieutenant colonel, I think, in the police force, and he graduated #1 in his class from the police academy. So in some ways, he touched a number of the boxes, right? Security forces and the business sector, and eventually, of course, became the head of government. He, in some ways, symbolized the rise of the Sino-Thai, and as I say, that's only continued in the 11 years since his overthrow.
Right, questions?
Hi, Roger Arnold. Just a quick question for you. Who has more to win or lose in this, in what you've described? Are the Americans have more to lose, or the Thais have more to lose? And a follow-up question is, the Chinese have already been pretty heavy-handed in the region as far as like Burma, currently the situation in Burma. I mean, I'm not a Thailand expert, but it's my general understanding that the previous king spent a considerable part of his life actually countering Chinese influence in Thailand. So, I mean, do the Thais that you talk to, do they have a historical knowledge of this, and how do they feel about it?
Mm-hmm. I will take your second question first. I think one of the challenges moving forward for the U.S.-Thai relationship is look, I talked about a generation gap earlier, whereby a whole host of, on both sides of the equation, on the American side and the Thai side, a whole generation of, first and foremost, military officers, but not excluding CIA officers, diplomats, and indeed civilians who got to know the country extremely well during the Vietnam War era and continued to maintain an interest in the country, an interest in the relationship, in many cases married into Thailand. And that whole generation that in some cases was educated in the United States if you were Thai, or fought in the jungles of Indochina if you were American, as I said, has all but retired or gone from the scene. And I think one of the challenges for the relationship moving forward is that the younger generation, of which even I'm included at 42, much less persons who are younger than I, don't have those direct experiences of the bilateral relationship, and neither are they being inculcated with knowledge of the relationship through places like the American Studies programs, the American centers that I just described in my remarks have been discontinued. Chuan Likpai said to me, the former prime minister from the both early and late 1990s, he said, you know, I'm the last pro-American prime minister, partly because I'm the last prime minister to remember how close the relationship was 10, 20, 30 years before. So I do think that there is a generation gap, and the only way for that to be bridged is through student exchanges and a whole host of other programs whereby, you know, people-to-people diplomacy is increased even as it's increased at the official level. Your first question about who stands the most to lose, the Thais, or you said, do the Thais have more to lose or the Chinese have more to gain? Look, insofar as Thailand is a U.S. ally by no fewer than 3 measures, Multilateral Pact of 1954, the Manila Pact.
Ben, what I was asking was who has more to lose, the Thais or the Americans in what you're describing, not the Thais or the Chinese.
The Thais or the Americans.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely the Americans, for the same reason I was about to say. Look, by 3 measures, Thailand is a treaty ally of the United States, multilaterally through the 1954 Manila Pact, bilaterally through the 1962 Tanat-Rusk communique, and loosely speaking through the major non-NATO status conferred on Thailand in 2003. For the Chinese to be able to flip a U.S. ally, one that had been in the U.S. sphere of influence for 60 years, is, no pun intended, that's a coup, right? That's a coup. So, you know, and ditto in the Philippines, in terms of Duterte's flirtation, increasing flirtation with the Chinese. That may be as short-lived as some of Trump's policies. It's hard to say. And I say this mostly in view of the geopolitical centrality of Thailand vis-a-vis some of the conflicts I mentioned in the South China Sea and in Taiwan. I'm not suggesting tonight, nor do I suggest in the book, that Thailand is or should be seen as geopolitically important as it was 50 years ago, right? We're not at the height of the Vietnam War in 1967. We're 2017, the Cold War ended, etc. But what I'm arguing is that the Chinese are very much playing a zero-sum game, and they're winning, in part because the Americans don't recognize it's a game that they're unwitting participants in.
Right. Please go to the microphone. and
Hi,
Q.
Jim Pollard, Asia Times. Congratulations, Ben. Impressive stuff. Just wondering, in terms of, if you were to type into Google Obama Yingluck photos, you see images of a US president who appears to be head over heels with the Prime Minister of Thailand when he met her. Do you think that momentary infatuation that Obama and Yingluck appeared to share, do you think that played a role in his, what appeared to be, you know, an emotional reaction from the Obama regime to the coup that deposed her in May 2014? And a second question, totally unrelated. You mentioned International Criminal Court investigation. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'll start with your second question. There has not been an ICC investigation into any of the wrongdoing in Thailand at the hands of either the Americans or anyone else. What I meant was, when in 2003, Thaksin decided to sign a status of forces agreement with the United States that would in turn shield US personnel in Thailand from the ICC's jurisdiction. My suspicion is that had something to do with the fact that both parties knew the Americans were torturing people on Thai soil. The ICC's jurisdiction commenced in July of 2003, July the 1st, 2003. The torture program globally happened well beyond that, wasn't discontinued until 2005, I believe. And the torture that took place on Thai soil was between mid-2002 and mid-2004. Smack in the middle of those dates is the jurisdiction of the ICC coming into force. The other thing in relation to the ICC is that, like George W. Bush himself, Thaksin, quote unquote, unsigned that treaty. It had never been ratified either by the US Senate or by Thailand's parliament, but both decided to unsign that treaty and therefore not to send it to their respective legislatures for ratification. Your first question with respect to the dynamic between Obama and Yingluck, I haven't given so much thought to be honest. We are in a bar, after all, Jim. No, I think part of the reaction was both-sided. I mean, the Americans were very express in telling me privately, as well as saying things in real time prior to the 2014 coup, that they did not expect the coup to happen. They were told expressly by the Thais, including by some of the generals who were part and parcel of the coup, that we will not do this. So part of Secretary Kerry's statement that came out within 4 or 5 hours of the coup, I was writing an op-ed for the Financial Times the night of the coup, partly because there was a curfew and I had nothing better to do, and I was aided, shockingly, within about 3 hours by this statement that came out of Washington. It was a template statement, right? It was basically a cookie-cutter statement. Coup happens in country X. This is the statement we make, and out the back door, here it is. But that was largely because the Americans were taken by surprise and angry, given that they had been directly told by certain people who had the knowledge that this wouldn't occur. And I also think then, conversely, you had some of that anger from the Thai side on account of how things had been handled differently in 2006. As I say, the substance of the two coup reactions was more or less the same. But the way in which Ambassador Boyce was able to handle and communicate the American message in 2006 was infinitely more sensitive and more effective than was the case 8 years on, in part because of his relationships. He met Thaksin for the first time in 1994. He knew Sarayud from probably the 80s, Sarayud who eventually became the military prime minister in the wake of Thaksin. And they joked with each other, if you read the WikiLeaks cables, that they were basically leaving Thailand at the same time. Sarayud was handing over to Samak, who had just won the election, and Boyce's term was up. And he even said to me, you know, when he left, he was the first ambassador to meet Sarayud when Sarayud was confirmed as prime minister. The Chinese were the second, and there was a little bit of a competition to see who was going to be able to meet Sarayud first. And he said he didn't even have to really ask for elections to be held within 12 months. Sarayut basically preempted him by saying, look, we're going to get this done within 12 months. And he said they were so happy, or he was so elated with this, that when he's leaving the building, and of course the reporters are door stopping them, he said, you know, there's a photo of me smiling, you know, almost with, you know, buddy with Sarayut. And he said that photo has not been kind to me throughout the rest of my career because of the implication that I was sort of in on all of this. But I think in 2014 the mutual distaste was on account really of how 2006 had been handled in relation to 2014.
By the way, Chuan Lik-pai was not the last pro-American prime minister, because Ban Han was very pro-American.
Yes, but Chuan post-dated Ban Han.
No, they came in between. Chuan, then Ban Han, then Chuan came back.
But that means Chuan's more recent.
Sorry?
That means Chuan is more recent.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there were two. Anyway, question. They both loved him.
Okay. Yes, please.
Good evening, Benjamin. My name is Motul Jean-Marie. I am a member of the club, and I have discovered a different phase of relation between China and US with Thailand. I have purchased an apparatus from iTech in California in Stanford Research System, and I discovered a taxation of 36% of this apparatus. So my question is, do you think that the relation with China and Thailand and Japan will go to lowering the tax over high-tech, but maintaining tax in front of the United States, following your opinion? Next visit of President Trump, for instance, the 30% will be maintained with US, but next meeting with the ASEAN community, China and Japan, will see a goodwill between those countries, you know, to lower taxation on importation of high-tech. And high-tech is very important for Thailand, as I know, from the Four River policy, as you know. Could you answer this question, Benjamin?
I think so. Dominic, could you assist?
I don't think I can. Can you repeat it very short and very clear?
Very short.
And clear. I couldn't understand it, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the level of taxation today on importation products.
Right, level of taxes on imports today.
Yes, from America.
Yeah.
As an example, I know, is 30%.
7%, yeah, from America.
You had 6% of add value taxes, but in China, I don't know the numbers. And in Japan too, do you know these numbers? And do you know if they are competitive with America today? So the policy you are explaining us now is a matter of trade, much more than a matter of strategy.
Right, well, do you know the comparative tariffs?
No, what I can say, broadly speaking, is that Thailand was one of 16 countries identified by the Trump administration as having a problematic trade imbalance with the United States, and that the U.S. is trying, not least through the sale of military arms and materiel, to lessen that trade imbalance. Trump's visit to the United States was, Prayut's visit to the United States last month was heavily influenced by the Ministry of Commerce here, as well as by the Department of Commerce in the United States, with a heavy, obviously a very heavy trade component. And if you look at the joint statement that came out of that visit, it focused very much on various economic deals with respect to coal and Boeing planes and other things. So whether or not it affects the tech industry, I don't know, but certainly that's playing a role in terms of what Trump's priorities are in terms of lessening that trade imbalance between the two countries. Yeah.
Right, one final question. Your book is very interesting for the position that you take on the Kra Canal, that you're so adamant that this is going to happen. I mean, it's always been treated as a bit of a joke. This canal, you can trace it back to the 16th century. It's very old. It's the world's oldest unfinished infrastructure.
Right.
Suvarnabhumi used to be sort of nudging along behind, but then they built it. So the Thais do these things. But anyway, it's fascinating. There are two things that come into play against building that thing, apart from the money, just the sheer expense.
Right.
One is that you would destroy Singapore.
Right.
So you would have a huge regional issue if you pressed ahead with it. Lee Kuan Yew actually once admitted that the only thing that kept him up at night, this was in the 60s, was the possibility that the Thais would actually build the Kra Canal, because that would destroy his dream.
Right.
The second thing is Thai deep South politics.
Right.
This whole idea that if the South is already alienated, if you then put a waterway across them and basically cut them off, it's not going to play well.
Right.
And yet you've come up with this very, very strong recommendation.
Right.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, I found it very interesting a few months ago, Dominic, that the club had a program on the
very
Krak
well
Canal.
attended, yeah.
Yeah, well attended, and I thought very well delivered. Both sides, right? There was an admiral from the Thai Navy that was staunchly opposed to the notion that it would ever get built, and there were others, of course, that took a side more analogous to my own. Look, I think the Chinese imperative is, as I said, at the moment, China is landlocked and through its southwest, which means its ability to move anything west to east to either the South China Sea or Taiwan is hindered by its over-reliance on the Straits of Malacca. And more importantly, China's ability to move anything to the southwest is hindered by the same clogged and US-controlled straits. It's why China has been trying for decades to find access to, maritime access to the Andaman Sea through, for example, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and most recently, Thailand. And of course, the western extension of the Andaman Sea is the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is where the plethora of, or the predominance of the Indian Navy is placed, and tensions between India and China continue to rise as well for dominance in that ocean. The effect it would have on Singapore is part and parcel of this, because Singapore, although not expressly so, is effectively a US ally. The only part of Obama's pivot to have been realized, other than the movement of Marines to Northern Australia, is in fact the movement of ships to Singapore. And although there's no formal base in Singapore, formal bases are anachronistic, right? Utapao Air Base has been, in the words of Pansak, Vinyarat, Thaksin's advisor, he said, you guys have been using Utapao to bomb the hell out of everybody for years, and no one has said a word about it, right? Whereas in the Philippines, Subic Bay was closed in the early 90s on account of the kind of political fallout you have when you call something a base. So Singapore basically has that status for the United States, and it would be geopolitically advantageous for China to be able to do exactly what you said, which is get that canal built and thereby neutralize Singapore's economic pole position that it has in this part of the world. I also know that money changes hands between wealthy Singaporeans and Thai parliamentarians every time this gets discussed, right? For the reasons that you say, yes. The Deep South, I think, is more, look, the Thai military does not have either the wherewithal or the interest in resolving the Deep South. We're talking about a conflict that goes back 110 years, 113 years, that has been, that was reignited in 2004, and now 13 years on is no closer to a solution than it was. Thaksin told me that when he was deputy prime minister to Shavalit in the late 90s, Shavalit put him in charge of the Krak Canal. He ran up against a host of governmental and, let's say, extra-governmental forces that prevented him from being able to get that done. And when he was then prime minister in the early 2000s, he tried again and ran up against the same issues. Thaksin's first foreign minister, Surikiart, said it is a complete non-starter for the reason that you said. The country would not tolerate being cut in half, to which I reply, somewhat as I did to Sean Crispin's question, I don't think Thailand is going to have the wherewithal to refuse, especially under an authoritarian government that is looking to China for infrastructural development and for a balance in its security calculus. So I mean, I do appreciate what you've said, that it is a long discussed infrastructure project, but I think the time is soon.
Great. Right, well, we've run for 2 hours, which is very good, and it's been a very quiet, attentive audience, which is always an extremely good sign. If you're looking to buy a copy of this book, you're too late. It's sold out here. We've sold 44 copies. If you want it signed, please come up and ask Benjamin to do it. I'd like to congratulate you from the club for this achievement. Putting out a book of that length is always quite something. We're actually introducing a policy in the club now of selling the books of members, not books on the region, only books written by members. And it's interesting that at the moment we're having a little bit of an uptake. So we'd like you to ask to put some signed copies on the shelves, and we'll sell them for you. So John and Kathy Zawacki, thank you very much for coming. I hope you feel it was worth the journey. Find out what he's been doing, wasting his time here for the last 15 years. And please all come back on Friday for the night shift in the Philippines, and next week to find out who may have killed Jim Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.